Hello, this is Ben Wikler. I'm joined by Thea, Deputy Chief of Staff here at the AFL-CIO for a progressive response and analysis of the State of the Union address. We are here at the AFL-CIO headquarters in the war room of digital activists and Netroots folks from across the labor and progressive movement. Right behind us is the White House, where the president is not at the moment because he is over at the Capitol building. But this is definitely the center of the action tonight, don't you think?
This is the place to be. You're here.
You have found the most important webpage on the internet if you're watching this right now. I guess several different web pages where it's embedded. But those are definitely the most exciting ones. And I have here a placard with several logos because tonight's live coverage is brought to you by the AFL-CIO, by MoveOn.org, and by The Good Fight, a MoveOn-powered podcast about people changing the world. I'm Ben Wikler, host of The Good Fight. And our coverage has begun. So this is a constitutionally mandated annual address, and it turns out that this year, as far as I can tell, he did not have a single 5-word summary of the State of the Union. It seemed like the State of the Union is, and then a whole bunch of different stuff, but thankfully we're here to fill in the gap.
Yes, I think that's right. It was, like the State of the Union often is, a little bit of a laundry list, a lot of different things that the president wants to get done, his assessment of where we are, what we need to do, where we need to go. And I guess one question is, what's different this year?
So one thing I felt was really different this year is that he had this kind of chipper tone about things that would be good, and he didn't really talk about the fact that we are locked in a giant battle. You know what I mean?
Yeah, he knows what he needs to get done, and I think the president's outlined a lot of great things, and if we could do everything that was in this speech, we would be in much better shape. But the problem is he faces this obstructionist, deadlocked Congress that is blocking every good thing that he needs to do, and he didn't really talk about how he's going to get beyond that.
Yeah, it was interesting. Like, what does a State of the Union address do, right? A State of the Union address says, here are things that we would like, and then here's how we get them. And he sort of did the first part. But he was talking to a room full of people who've been actively at every step of the way stopping him from doing any of this stuff. And he sort of left that out. And it's weird because it's an election year where all of these issues and the possibility of making progress on all these issues will be decided.
And a lot of the people in that room are going to run for election, for re-election, on the basis of helping or blocking.
Yeah.
And he needs to really put that at their doorstep. He needs to put the Republicans who are blocking all the job-creating measures on notice that we're going to take this to them in November if they don't become more cooperative.
Mr. President, if you're watching right now and you have the opportunity to go back and adjust your speech, that is our strongest recommendation tonight, which is take it to them, man. We want you to fight. We want you to fight on behalf of all the stuff that we care about. So I think that is a top line that all of us wanted, not just to kind of applaud politely or somehow John Boehner managed to applaud impolitely, which I was really impressed by.
Or grumpily polite.
Yeah, it seemed like the most begrudging applause I've seen in my entire lifetime. But you know, there was less of the stand up and cheer and pump your fist moments, except for the weirdly kind of jammed in reference to the Olympics. Aside from that, it didn't have.
And you know you're in bad shape when you need to rely on the Olympics to get a big applause line.
I know. Sochi is kind of the
whatever.
Yeah. But there was some good stuff. So let's talk a little bit about the best moments. Then we are joined. We should note by two extraordinary guests tonight. First, we will be talking to Bill Spriggs, the chief economist here at the AFL-CIO, particularly about inequality and the minimum wage. And then later by Damon Silvers, the director of policy at the AFL-CIO, who's going to help pull the lens back and talk about what the president didn't talk about with the economy and why we have the inequality and stagnation that we're experiencing. There was a big missing part of the speech, I think, that was maybe cut at the last second by the Chamber of Commerce's official speechwriter editor.
The censor from the Chamber of Commerce.
Yeah, I don't know why they let that guy into the room. So first, favorite moments. Let's take a couple each. What was the moment? Well, I will tell the moment that made me the happiest. And I have a 2-year-old son at home. His name is Mac. I don't think he's watching at the moment, but if you are, hi. My favorite moment was when he was talking about the economy and women and men and parenthood and families and inequality and the wage gap. And he just gave this rousing tirade that I've never heard this president give about how to make this economy work for families. I thought that was just great. He really didn't pull punches. And there was this one little moment where he said, you know, women should be able to take a day off when their child is sick. And then he said, and men should be able to as well. And I, having had that experience, I think that is a great idea. So that was probably my single favorite moment coming out of it.
And a great moment, one that was not a surprise because he signaled it earlier this morning, was about raising the minimum wage for all federally contracted workers. So that's long overdue. It's a great thing to do. It's really important. It's going to help a lot of people's lives, and it sets a good example for the whole country. So I think that's something that he's been talking about for a long time, but we need to see President Obama out in the forefront of this, raising wages, raising minimum wages, taking care of federal employees, and this was a good signal that he's going to put a lot of weight on that.
Yes. One part that was maybe the least exciting part of the whole speech, but I was really happy about, was when he was talking about Iran. Because he is a president who is facing Congress, people from both parties, who have been pushing basically for policies that could lead to a war, for these incredibly irresponsible bills threatening extra sanctions in the middle of negotiations. And the president at that moment, he was talking to the government of Iran, and he was talking to the American people and to Congress about something that really matters. And I felt like he was treating us all like grown-ups, which might not be warranted in some cases, but nonetheless, it was this moment when it was like, okay, this guy's the president, you know, he's taking his responsibilities really seriously, and if he gets through his administration with like a vastly better relationship with Iran and without a nuclear Iran and with you know, policies that allow the people of Iran to flourish and be a peaceful partner with us, that is a giant accomplishment, and that would not have happened if we'd elected any of the other two guys in the last two rounds. So that was something, that was kind of like a satisfied, contented moment in my soul, even though it wasn't a fist-pumping moment.
And I had one more moment, which came towards the beginning of the speech when he talked about working with Congress on things that he could, but then he said very clearly, America won't stand still and neither will I. That was his signal that he is going to use his executive powers to do what needs to be done, even if Congress won't move. And I think that's an important message to Congress.
I know. My only regret was that he wasn't on a standing kind of treadmill as he said it, because he could have illustrated that point so vividly. Instead, he was standing still as he said he wasn't standing still. But nonetheless, a good moment. So we are now joined by Bill Spriggs, the chief economist here at the AFL-CIO. As he joins us, we're going to take a tweet. If you are watching this and you would like to ask us a question, raise a point for us to engage, then I urge you to tweet with the hashtag SOTUnion, which is SOTUNION, State of the Union. It's like a
Really?
Yeah, it's just a extraordinarily perfect hashtag for this moment, I feel. The tweet that I would like to note, this is from Sean G. McKell 27S with an underscore. Why wouldn't everyone stand up when Barack Obama talks about raising the minimum wage? Why wouldn't everyone stand up? It's a great question. Bill Spriggs, you're here to help us figure it out. Thank you for joining us on the live AFL-CIO Move On Good Fight coverage of the State of the Union address.
Great to join you.
Thank you. And folks here in our live studio war room, feel free to join us for round of applause for our guests. So why wasn't everyone standing at that moment? Surely everyone supports a living wage that keeps families out of poverty.
Well, I thought it was a moment that the president could have used more of his rhetorical skills. I thought he could have really gotten people to stand up. And it was kind of flat in the sense that earlier in the day he let us all know that he was going to do this for federal contract workers. And yet that moment kind of slipped. And you're right, didn't get the members of Congress standing up in the way they did for the Olympians. And it was the kind of moment where you would have thought, oh, the Democratic Party will really rally around him. And instead they felt warm and fuzzy, but they didn't give the kind of response I would have hoped for. And again, I think it was because it wasn't built up. It wasn't a real rhetorical high spot, and it could have been. You know, earlier it was a little disappointing because the president said, look, we didn't get into this situation yesterday or even with the Great Recession. For 30 years before then, we had rising inequality, but then he blamed it on technology and global competition. Now, global competition, yes, but he could have mentioned bad trade deals. It's really policy that got us in this situation. And that was the moment to say, so we have to reverse the policies. And it was a moment for him using his skills to say, before Congress and everybody told you, be good to business and they'll be good to you. Worship the God creators and the job creators, and sacrifice your kids to SNAP cuts, and we don't have to feed your kids because the job creators will be angry. And if we can kill more kids by starving them to death, we'll have more jobs. He didn't. Instead, what did he do? He just sort of said, well, here's a guy up there who runs a pizza parlor, and he raised the wages of his workers, and that was a good thing. And that was it. It didn't get to the core of government needs to be on the side of the people. This needs to be government for the people. One of the things is that government can be for you having higher wages, and we have to back away from thinking government can't be for the people.
Bill, that was an interesting moment when the president said, I'm going to call on all employers to kind of step up and raise wages. And that's a good thing. We'd like to see employers step up and raise wages. But what's missing from that equation? Are we just exhorting employers out of the goodness of their heart and their conscience to do the right thing by their workers? Or do we need something else?
Yeah, and right there was another moment when he could have said, one of the things over the 30 years is we lost the ability for workers to stand up for their own rights. We lost union membership, and we can get it back. And that was a chance for him to say, and that's why, and then he could have said something. I mean, he's doing an executive order on the minimum wage. He could have done an executive order talking about employers following the National Labor Relations Act. He could have talked about more good things that employers should do if they're going to be government contractors. So there was a lot more room for him to talk about those institutions and those things that matter, like unions.
I felt like it was kind of a policy environment with no responsibility and no politics. He didn't even ask the American people to press for anything. This is a moment when everyone's watching. He could have said, workers, stand up and demand higher wages. They were missing from the equation.
Well, he could have, and I put in a blog, I said he should have had one of the Walmart workers. He could have had one of the $15 an hour workers sitting there in the box, pointed to them, not just an employer who said, I'm going to pay my workers more, but he could have said, and there are workers who want this, and I'm with them because this is government for the people. We need an economy for the. That was his moment,
yeah,
and it wasn't there. So it was that part was disappointing.
So if he had assigned responsibility for the inequality and and then laid out policies to go after it, where should he have put it?
Well, I think he could have pointed to not just a policy, but an attitude that I mentioned before. We have existed with this mantra of trickle down, that we have to do things that make sense to business, not things that make sense to building a strong middle class. And if you want to reverse it, then you have to have a speech that really goes strongly in the direction that inequality isn't just, I care about the poor because he should, but the middle class need to care about the poor because they're 1.5 steps away from being poor. And as my mother would always say, you're talking about somebody in the grave, but I think you're like, 3 feet in. So, the middle class has to be worried about the poor for that very reason. And so he could have regalvanized us to be the 99% at the bottom and understood that the government needs to be for that 99% and talk about unions, talk about free trade agreements that really are about trade and not about investment, to talk about restoring rights of workers, restoring paths to the middle class. And he tried to hit too many other notes. And if you really want to galvanize people and move them in this other direction and understand why cities and governors are ahead of Congress and why he was taking the step that he was taking, why those workers are out there protesting, and he's on their side, then he could have isolated Congress. Congress, don't you get it? Yep. The mayors have been doing it. The governors have been doing it. Workers are doing it. I'm doing it. Where are you?
I think we need a little more of whacking upside the head.
Yes.
In terms of Congress totally failing to do anything, to get anything done other than try to repeal Obamacare 47 times. But they haven't, and right now we're sitting here, we're poised at this moment where there's a lot of public support for increasing the minimum wage and indexing it to inflation, increasing the tip minimum wage. There's a lot of support out there, and Congress is just lying around on its butt, doing nothing. And John Boehner, the man sitting in back of President Obama, is responsible for failing to bring a lot of things to a vote, and the same with comprehensive immigration reform. We have a do-nothing Congress, and the president wasn't strong enough in calling them out.
It felt like this was a speech that was written in the White House and then taken through a tunnel to the Capitol without ever going out into the street. Because there have been people in the streets of this country throughout the last year. People have been winning these fights in their states, in their cities, as you're saying. People have been, protesting, the fast food workers and Walmart workers. And that is actually a big part of the story of this country in the last year. It's a progressive, resurgent moment. It's a movement moment. And the speech really didn't have any of that. It felt like it had happened. It felt like, the 2012 campaign was 2 years ago now. They'd had a year just being totally inside of D.C., and it didn't speak to this feeling that so many people have across the country that they want to fight back. They're ready for the fight.
Yeah, and so it still had that kind of top-down approach. And he said he was going to come to Washington to reinvent democracy, that we were really going to have a bottom-up kind of approach. And he could have celebrated these bottom-up moments. And instead of simply saying some mayors or some governors, he really could have talked about the organizers in SeaTac who got $15 an hour passed by the people in that community who understood that workers have to be paid a decent wage. And he could have talked about why should the federal government be paying contractors and then turn around and have to pay food assistance for those same workers? What sense does that make? He could have raised these kind of issues that workers have been raising and raised up, as you said, the many movements that are out there to remind Congress that they are really on the wrong side of history on this one.
Yeah, we're seeing successes all around the country with state and local minimum wage campaigns, and especially when we take it to the voters. Because that's what we see, is that when people get their hands on it and they have a chance to really speak out on this, that they support it. And the president's on the right side. We need a better plan.
Yeah. Bill Spriggs, Chief Economist at the AFL-CIO, thank you so much for joining us here for a live coverage of the State of the Union address from AFL-CIO HQ in Washington, D.C.
Thanks for having me.
All right. I'm Ben Wikler. I'm joined by Thea Lee here at the AFL-CIO in front of the White House, where the president will soon be returning to the presidential suite and watching the tail end of this coverage. If you would like to ask us a question or propose an idea for us to consider, please tweet hashtag SOTUNION, SOTUnion, which is appropriate to our location. So we talked about some of our favorite things tonight.
Yes.
We've talked about some of the missing or frustrating moments of the economic discussion. I'd like to talk a little bit more about just the things that weren't there.
Okay.
The things that could have been there. And there's one area especially, that just grabs me, which is on immigration. The president talked a little bit about comprehensive immigration reform. That was very nice. We have a broken system. I'm glad he talked about that. He talked about the economy. He didn't use the word citizenship. And he didn't use the word deportation. And those are two really big things happening in relation to immigration. So it felt, it was kind of...
This is a really important moment in the immigration debate, because it's hard to get comprehensive immigration reform passed, but the most important thing is that we do keep that pathway to citizenship, and we need to stop those deportations. That's something the president can do on his own with his executive power, and he needs to do that. But I think it's really important that we hear from the president. We hear that leadership about the path to citizenship, because there's a lot of folks saying, oh, it's time to compromise, it's time to weaken, it's time to settle for something less. And I think it's really important we not do that, and we needed to hear the president say that tonight, that he's going to stand with us in terms of really holding out for the path to citizenship and comprehensive immigration reform. That's really important.
This is one of these things, right, that only gets passed if there's a huge, powerful movement, if there's an upswell of people pressing their members of Congress, and the Republicans in the House are on the fence about it. And this is the one chance Obama has to really rally everybody around the vision of what he's trying to achieve. But he deported the word citizenship, I'm afraid to say. It was one of the many unfortunate deportations that's happened during this administration. that was a swing and a whiff, unfortunately. What did you wish was in there?
Well, I guess it wasn't a big surprise when he talked about trade policy that he talked about it in kind of a tired, old-fashioned way where you have this robotic rhetoric of free trade that we've heard over and over again for 20 years now that, oh, if we just have more trade agreements, we'll have more exports, we'll have more jobs, it'll help small businesses. And he sort of trotted out that same line again. He talked about bipartisan trade promotion authority, which is another word for fast track, which is really problematic. This is just a big disappointment for us in terms of the Obama administration, that when he campaigned for office, he did talk about the need to have a new trade policy, a different trade policy, to reform it, to really change the focus of trade policy, and he's let us down.
Yeah.
And so, we have the Trans-Pacific Partnership, we have Fast Track Authority, which seem to be on the same track as the old trade agreements, which really haven't worked.
Yeah.
They haven't delivered on the promises, and so it wasn't a surprise, but it was a disappointment.
It's possible to have an unsurprising disappointment, but it is an unfortunate kind of disappointment if you're going to have one. I also feel like if the president's going to say the exact same thing that he said in previous State of the Union addresses, he should just have a recording that he can play, and then he can get a drink of water or stretch. You know what I mean? Like, those are golden opportunities to kind of recollect his energy while he plays back the tape on things that he's previously said. And there were a whole bunch of opportunities like that I would have really enjoyed it if he'd had like a hologram there.
It was like a Groundhog Day kind of State of the Union.
Yeah, there were these little groundhog moments.
Where it's like, am I waking up again and it's Groundhog Day again and I'm having the exact same speech that I've heard several times
Which
before?
explains why John Boehner looked like Bill Murray during certain key moments in the address. I was wondering about that, and that explains it. All right, we are going to take a couple of tweets, and then we will be joined by Damon Silvers, the Director of Policy here at the AFL-CIO. I'm going to retrieve my phone, which has mysteriously escaped my grip. All right. So one of our tweeters says, I would have liked to hear more about LGBTQ rights and mass incarceration. I think those are two separate issues that they're addressing.
Yes.
And yes, I feel that way. What did he say? There was like one glancing reference that I remember to LGBTQ rights.
Yeah, I might have missed it.
I might have
missed it. But mass incarceration is an important issue. That's something the AFL-CIO took up at our convention, and it's something that our folks are really focused on, is trying to address some of the inequities, the economic inequities, and the moral inequities that happen when so many people's lives are wasted, they're stuck in jail, and it's really been a travesty that we would have liked to hear President Obama talk more about tonight.
I agree with that tweet. There are more people in federal, state prisons and jails than there are contractors who will be affected by the minimum wage increase you mentioned tonight. And I'd like to see both of those numbers change in opposite directions. All right, we are joined now by Damon Silvers. Welcome to our live State of the Union post-game progressive coverage and response here at the AFL-CIO headquarters. Thanks for being on. What did you think of the speech tonight?
Well, first, it's great to be with you both. I thought sort of several different things at the same time.
Say them one at a time, if you will.
I'm going to try, and those of you who know me know that that's a challenge. I thought that, unlike some of President Obama's past State of the Union speeches, that the basic values and messaging of the speech was pretty unambiguously sort of true to what working people care about. And I thought that was really very good. And I think that, here at the AFL-CIO, we ought to really give the president some credit for that. Because, as you were both discussing, he was speaking to a group of people there in the Congress, many of whom really don't share those values. And I think Thea was talking earlier about, sort of Congress not doing its duty. And the president, it takes a certain amount of courage to go in there with a really clear sort of set of values that the people there who work for the 1% don't like.
Let's give him a round of applause for that.
I think that was.
I'm with that.
I think that was really good. Now, I think he had two challenges coming into that speech, given what he'd been saying about inequality before, and I think he met one of those challenges, and I think he pretty much failed the other. All right, the two challenges were, one, was he going to talk about inequality as something that is happening to not the 10% at the bottom of our economic structure, but to the 90%. Right? So inequality is something which 90% of us are suffering from, and 10% of us are gaining from. Right? And I choose those numbers. That's not like made up numbers. That's essentially where the split is. Since 1993, 90% of Americans have seen a loss in income, and 10% have seen a gain.
Wow.
All right. Now, he made really clear in his speech that that the challenge of inequality, the challenge of shared prosperity, was a majoritarian challenge. He did that. He didn't succumb to what I think a lot of the Republicans believe, which is that as long as a few of us get rich, it doesn't matter what happens to the rest of us. Right? And I think there were some people, unfortunately, in the Democratic Party who were pushing the president in that direction over the last few days. He didn't go there. And instead, he went to the truth about our society and our economy and our values. And he was really good at it in his closing paragraph. His closing paragraph really got to the heart of what working people believe in about America. And I think that was great. The other challenge, he failed. And the other challenge is the challenge of what some people have talked about as the passive voice.
Yeah.
Right? And I think Thea was talking about this earlier in your program, right? That inequality didn't just happen. It didn't fall out of the sky. It's not the product. It didn't happen. It didn't create itself. It's not the product of impersonal forces. Right? People made it happen. Right? Powerful people, wealthy people, politicians who answered to them over a generation made it happen. They dismantled things about our country that working people, bled and died for, that made our country for a while, right, the envy of the world in terms of the distribution of wealth and in terms of the ability of a person who does their part, right, to enjoy a good life. Right? They took that apart, right? And the president failed in this speech to be clear about what the sources of inequality are, about who did it. And that's both a failure of truth, a failure of courage, but it's also something else. It's a profound failure of political opportunity. And the reason why that's so is because when you talk to the American public, as the president does in the State of the Union, and you say to the American public, we have a problem of inequality, right? Different people hear different things. Right?
Yeah.
Some people hear, oh, the president thinks I have too much, right? Now, but when you start naming names and you start saying this is a problem of the 1%, right? This is a problem of the Walton family, the richest family on earth, refusing to pay the 1.4 million Americans who work for them very hard, right? A minimum of $25,000 a year, right? That's what this is about. It's about people making decisions. Then people start to hear something different. This is about Jamie Dimon, the man who runs J.P. Morgan Chase, right? Took a lot of bailout money, benefited in a lot of different ways from government policy.
Should be in jail.
There's that.
Getting a 74% pay raise from $11 million to $20 million, while 10 million American families have been thrown out of their homes in the financial crisis that company and that individual helped make happen, right? When people hear that, then they understand what the president's talking about. He's talking about a tiny minority of us who are benefiting and the vast majority of us who need an economy that works for all. Failing to name names fails to grasp this political opportunity.
And Damon, I think that's exactly right. I mean, it's partly an analytical problem, like how did we get here? Why do we have this problem? Did it fall out of the sky or is it created by policies? But it's also about the concrete policies that he says he wants to put forward. You can't have the right solutions to the problem if you haven't named how we got there correctly.
This is so true. You end up, if you don't understand that this is about people making decisions, then you end up with this kind of thing that the president had in his speech where he said exactly the right thing around wages. He said, we must have rising wages in this country. But he then kind of made what unfortunately sounded like a kind of powerless plea for employers to kind of go through a sort of moral conversion. Yeah. Please.
And do the right thing.
That's always how wages have gone up in the past, in fairness. Someone says please, and then that's it. Because power always concedes something without a demand.
All right, let me tell you a story about how wages actually go up in this country. All right, Henry Ford, who's often given a lot of credit for raising wages, during the Great Depression, Henry Ford cut wages savagely, right? And his workforce was literally starving, right? And his workforce and unemployed Detroiters marched on his factory to demand food.
So the problem was that the managers didn't start food drives within the factories the way they do at Walmart.
Right. So they went to plea for food. Right. 40,000 Detroiters marched up to the gates of the Ford auto plant and said, "Please, can we have some food?" And Henry Ford, in response, had the guards on the roof of the building open fire on the crowd with machine guns, killed 5 people. Right. That strategy didn't work so well. Right. When those same workers down the street at General Motors 3 years later occupied their factories and said, basically, we're not going to make anything until you pay us fairly and talk to us, that worked.
There's a lesson there. I can't put my finger on it, but there's a lesson there. Damon Silvers, thank you so much for joining us here on our
Very
live
welcome.
coverage.
Lovely to be with you.
Thank you, David.
I'm Ben Wikler. This is Thea Lee. We're at the AFL-CIO on the MoveOn.org Good Fight live streaming progressive coverage and response to the President's State of the Union address. You can tweet us at SOTUnion, State of the Union. That's a hashtag, and we will respond. We're going to take another couple of tweets in just a moment. But one thing I want to put my finger on from what we were just discussing, a lot of politics is about sides, about knowing that there are different sides in a conflict or a struggle and knowing whose side you're on. And I think sometimes when you explain what the sides are in a debate, people understand which side they're on and they get active. And that was kind of the missing thread through this whole thing, right? There were explanations for why something would be good. There were pleas for that good thing to happen, but there was never really that contrast. There was never an us that's calling for something and a sense of a them that's getting in the way of it.
Well, the president is so polite.
Yeah.
He is.
He's very polite.
He doesn't say Republicans in Congress are wrecking the economy. But sometimes he needs to do that. But I think that's part of the issue is also, I want to talk about how it actually affects the policies that are put forward, because I agree with Damon that there were a lot of things to like about the president and about the president's speech, and he has good values. You can see it when he talks. I think he looks so sincere, and I honestly believe he cares. But some of the policies don't add up, and so one of them, for example, he talked about a lot of things that are really important for the economy. We need investments in infrastructure. We need universal pre-kindergarten.
Yes, he had a wonderful thing about
We need retirement
pre-K,
security. Those are all things that are absolutely essential. We need better quality education for everybody. They all cost money, especially infrastructure. If we're going to do it on the scale that we need, we have a $3.3 trillion infrastructure deficit right now. Then we need to raise some taxes. And he shies off of that. He talked about closing loopholes, which is a great thing. It's needed. But he also doesn't say, and we need to raise taxes on the wealthiest 1%, and we need to raise taxes on corporations because they're not paying their fair share. And that is one of the crucial missing elements to the policy that would make it all fall together. It's
interesting because he's spoken about those things so many times in the past, and he didn't this year. And when they don't happen this year, he will not have put down a marker about who asked for it and who didn't deliver. And that's something, it's now sort of falls to all of us to make extremely clear who's actually working on this stuff and who's not. That's something I wish the president had done. Thankfully, we have a flood of markers from our friends in the Twitter sphere. Mm-hmm. I am now opening the official Good Fight Live State of the Union coverage Google Doc to see these tweets. All right, 1. Expecting the president to take on causes of inequality and who's responsible will always end in disappointment. I disagree. I'm afraid I disagree because remember in 2012? Do you remember, before the election, the president actually did talk about this stuff, and he had this rant in a previous State of the Union address about if you send this bill to me, I will sign it right now. And he talked about the investments that we needed to make, and changes to the tax code that we needed to make, and he hammered on that, and people totally got it. So I don't think it's always a disappointment. I think it's just sometimes a disappointment.
And this is his second term.
Yeah.
He's not running for re-election again. What does he have to lose?
Yeah.
From being more confrontational, just a little more confrontational.
Just a little, Mr. President, please. All right, next note. State of the Union, what about employment policies for people with disability, undocumented, and transgender folks? Those are good questions. There was one moment when he talked about employment discrimination against the currently unemployed, and I thought that was great, and I appreciate the White House's leadership on that. But as we were saying, there was actually very little about LGBTQ folks, and there are policies that he could have, put forward that we know now have increasingly broad support across this country, and that we know that the president's rhetorical leadership on this stuff can actually move public opinion in America. We saw it with marriage equality. Seeing him take a step forward on trans rights in America would have been so amazing, and that was something he kind of crab walked to the side away from. I felt like
It'd be wonderful to hear him use his bully pulpit on that particular front.
Yes. All right, one more tweet. Please talk about fracking and the TPP. Thank you.
Okay,
All right. I would like to take fracking, and maybe you could take TPP.
you got it.
This maybe my least favorite moment with the speech was when he was cheerleading for our increased oil production, and then even more excitedly for our natural gas production. There was this big thing about how great it is that we're making all this natural gas, and yes, unit per unit natural gas has less carbon than oil, but there's still a lot of carbon in there, plus you have to frack to get it, and it's a disaster. It's really an ugly thing, and it's not the future of how we're going to combat climate change in this country. And he didn't even speak to the sort of trade-offs or the challenges about it. It was kind of a full-throated, let's produce a lot more fossil fuels. And then he talked about climate change, and there was some okay stuff in there. But it sort of, I just actually don't get how you can be that excited about especially increased oil production at the same time as you understand that climate change is an actual thing. And I would have, and on fracking it was just a complete.
He was nice and clear on the reality of climate change.
Yes.
And I think it's important, especially on fracking, that that we be thinking at every time about worker safety and about the environment, and not be so dazzled by the promise of natural gas reserves.
In fairness, when you light a huge thing of natural gas on fire, it is totally amazing to look at. It looks like a little fireworks display right in your sink. But that's it's something to look at with a critical distance.
And so on TPP, which was the other question, so the Trans-Pacific Partnership, I think the president had a sort of a oblique reference about new trade partnerships with Asia and Europe. The Transatlantic Partnership and the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The Trans-Pacific Partnership is a 12-country trade agreement that is pretty far down the road. It's not done yet. It's still being negotiated. And it includes a lot of countries that we already have trade agreements with, like Canada and Mexico and Australia. And then some countries that we don't, like Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, New Zealand, Japan. But there's enormous economic potential impacts on American workers. And the agreement's not done, but everything we've seen and we've heard about it so far leads us to believe it looks too much like the trade agreements of the past, too much like the NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, whether it's investment or other provisions. It is still about multinational corporations moving jobs around, having their investments protected, having their copyrights protected, and not a complete change of mindset where we need to think about working people and the environment and consumers.
Yeah.
And so it's a disappointment that it's going in the wrong direction. And he mentioned it very obliquely, which is interesting.
It's interesting.
I think he didn't want to take it on too much.
Yeah, this is a treaty that would remove our ability to support innovation and access to medicines around the world, because it would give drug companies carte blanche to stop countries from creating generic versions of drugs in places where they can't afford the patented drugs. It limits access to innovation. It undercuts countries' abilities to put forth environmental protections, and it undercuts worker protections. And the only reason we know a lot of this stuff is because it was WikiLeaked, which is not a very democratic way to find out about to find out about your trade agreements.
We need a really different process with trade. We need to bring people in at early stages, whether it's environmental or consumer or labor organizations or citizens. People should have more access to the negotiating documents at an early stage so they can have input and they can understand there's going to be enormous impacts on their lives, and it shouldn't be done behind closed doors. I think that's really important.
Yeah. We will hope that the draft that we've seen of the TPP is just so much TP, and that the newer versions will be
1,000 times better.
1,000 times better. All right. We're nearing the conclusion of tonight's live progressive State of the Union response from the AFL-CIO headquarters. We are going to look for potentially one more tweet, and then I think we're going to let everyone retire to their Twitters, their Facebooks, and their internets, and their loved ones.
And their PJs.
And their PJs, yes. For whatever they need to do following the State of the Union address tonight. All right. I will reform our surveillance programs. We buying this?
With prudent drone policies.
With prudent drone policies, yes. Yeah, there was one moment where we had the drones, and then we had the NSA reforms, and then we had closing Guantanamo. And with Guantanamo, he said, this is about living up to our Constitution. This is about our national traditions, our values, the balance we need to strike. And I totally agree with all those things as applied to Guantanamo, and also the other things. It was like his argument for scaling back drones a little bit and NSA a little bit were about perception management. He said we need to do less drone attacks because we don't want people to feel as though we are. I don't think he said bombing weddings, but he said something concerning. And then he said that we need to scale back, or we need to deal with our NSA issues so that people have confidence in our intelligence agencies.
No, we just need to stop.
Yeah, I mean, we should actually respect our Constitution and human life all over the place, and that's a good way to win some friends and some peace. That was a moment.
We needed a little more clarity.
A little more clarity. So if tonight turns out to have been a dress rehearsal, tomorrow, Mr. President, if you give a second State of the Union address, just zero in on those particular points. Give us what the whole world wants to hear, and we will be thrilled. In the meantime, we applaud all the good stuff that you talked about, and we especially applaud you giving the Republicans the opportunity to demonstrate that they weren't applauding basic things that everybody should agree on.
Minimum wage,
ending
the war.
Equality for women. And we applaud our audience tonight. Thank you for joining us for this first ever live, progressive, good fight AFL-CIO, MoveOn.org response to the State of the Union address. I'm Ben Wikler.
I'm Thea Lee.
We're here at the AFL-CIO headquarters. Thanks for joining us.
And good night. You did it.